He who explains himself has already lost. Not might lose, not risks losing, has already lost. Past tense, the moment the explaining starts. You've been told the opposite your whole life. That honesty means explaining yourself. That a good person answers every question, defends every decision, clears up every misunderstanding. Because silence looks like guilt, and guilt is what innocent people don't have. That's the lie. The people who actually hold power in a room are almost never the ones talking the most. This isn't a video about being rude or about stonewalling people who love you. It's about a discipline the Stoics understood 2,000 years before modern psychology caught up to it. The discipline of not needing to be believed. Washington, D.C., 1927. A dinner party, the kind where everyone is slightly too aware of who else is at the table. A young woman leans toward the guest of honor. She's heard the stories about him, the silences that stretch on for whole minutes, the reporters who leave press conferences with nothing but a headache, and she decides to test it herself. "Mr. President," she says, "I made a bet today that I could get more than 2 words out of you." Calvin Coolidge looks at her, doesn't smile, doesn't lean in, doesn't do any of the small performative things a man does when he wants to be liked. "You lose," he says. That's the whole exchange. 2 words. And it's been retold for almost 100 years, because it captures something people instinctively recognize as power, even if they can't name why. Coolidge wasn't cold. He wasn't socially inept. The man wrote his own speeches, read voraciously, and by every account had a sharp, dry wit. What he refused to do was perform for an audience that hadn't earned his effort. He understood something most people spend their whole careers unlearning the hard way. That every word you offer beyond what's necessary is a word someone else can use against you. Coolidge served through one of the most turbulent stretches of the American economy, through scandal-plagued predecessors, through a press corps hungry for a quote to twist. He left office with his reputation almost entirely intact. Historians still argue about his economic policy. Almost nobody argues about his character. And the through line connecting both of those facts is the same. He didn't explain himself into corners. Now hold that image, because we're going to build the entire architecture of this video around one question. Why does explaining yourself, something that feels responsible, mature, even kind, so often work against you? And what did the Stoics know about this that we've collectively forgotten? Start with the mechanics, because this isn't mysticism, it's leverage. When you explain yourself unprompted, you are communicating one thing beneath the words. I need you to see me differently than you currently do. That's the entire transaction. It doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't matter if the explanation is true, fair, and reasonable. The act itself signals a deficit, a gap between how you're being perceived and how you want to be perceived, and you are the one trying to close it. Epictetus, writing in the Discourses, draws the line with brutal clarity. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Our own judgments, our own choices, our own actions, up to us. Other people's opinions of those actions, never up to us, not even slightly. The Stoic who has actually internalized this doesn't chase the correction of a false impression, because chasing it means treating something outside his control as though it were inside it. Here's the part modern psychology adds to that ancient observation. Researcher Adam Galinsky, who has spent decades studying the psychology of power at Columbia and Northwestern, found something consistent across dozens of studies. People who feel powerful communicate in shorter, more direct, less qualified language. People who feel powerless hedge. They over-explain. They pad their statements with justification because on some subconscious level, they're negotiating for the right to be heard at all. So when you launch into an unprompted explanation, you're not just giving information. You're broadcasting your position in the hierarchy of that interaction, and you're broadcasting it as lower than the person you're explaining to. That's point one. Explanation is confession. Before you say anything else, you've already told the room where you think you stand. Trial lawyers have a saying that never makes it into the courtroom dramas. Don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to. There's a quieter cousin of that rule, one taught to witnesses being prepped for cross-examination. Never volunteer. The reason is almost mathematical. A direct answer closes a topic. An explanation opens three more. Say a prosecutor asks a witness where he was on the night in question, and the witness answers with the address. Done. Closed. But the moment that witness adds why he was there, what he was thinking, how he felt about it, he has just handed the opposing attorney an entirely new set of threads to pull. Every clause in an explanation is a hinge someone else can push on. You didn't just answer the question. You wrote 3 new questions for your opponent for free. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss makes a version of this same point in Never Split the Difference. The people who negotiate best aren't the ones filling silence with justification. They let a pause sit. They let the other side fill it instead. Because whoever talks first, to break an uncomfortable silence, usually talks their way into a worse position. Voss built an entire career on a principle Coolidge lived by instinct. The person doing the least explaining is almost always the one in control of the room. Every clause in an explanation is a hinge someone else can push on. Translate this out of the courtroom and into your actual life. Every time you over-explain a decision to a colleague, a partner, a parent, you're not persuading them. You're handing them raw material. You're saying, here are 7 reasons. Please pick whichever one is easiest to dismantle. And they will. Not necessarily out of malice, just because that's what a mind does when it's handed an open door. It walks through the weakest one. The Stoic response to this isn't secrecy for its own sake. It's economy. Say the thing that needs to be said, once, cleanly, and then let it stand on its own weight instead of propping it up with 6 additional supports that are really just 6 additional vulnerabilities. There's a well-documented finding in behavioral psychology called the overjustification effect, first mapped out by researchers Mark Lepper, David Green, and Richard Nisbet in a study back in the early 1970s. Children who genuinely enjoyed drawing were split into groups. One group was told in advance they'd get a reward for drawing. Another wasn't. The kids who expected a reward, once the reward was removed, drew significantly less than before. The external justification had displaced the internal one. The activity that used to explain itself now needed a reason bolted onto it, and without that reason, it collapsed. Here's the extension of that finding that most people miss. The same mechanism applies to your decisions, not just your hobbies. Every time you attach an external justification to something you did for your own reasons, you shift the foundation of that decision from internal and stable to external and negotiable. And anything negotiable can be renegotiated by whoever's listening. Think about what happens when someone asks why you turned down a job, ended a friendship, said no to a request. Instead of a short answer, you give them a paragraph. In that moment, you're converting a decision that was solid into a position that's now open for debate, because you just showed them exactly which levers move you. A decision that needs defending was never really a decision. It was a request for permission wearing a decision's clothes. Marcus Aurelius understood this. In Book 5 of the Meditations, he writes about waking each morning and reminding himself he will meet people who are ungrateful, meddling, and dishonest. Not so he can resent them. So he isn't destabilized when their reaction to his choices isn't the one he wanted. He doesn't need their approval to already be sure of his own action. That's the discipline. Decide. Act. Let the decision justify itself through its results over time, rather than through a speech delivered in the moment you're least equipped to give one, because you're still standing in the emotional wake of having just made it. There's a phrase that circulated through British political and royal culture for over a century. Never complain, never explain. It's been attributed to statesman Benjamin Disraeli, though the strongest documented usage traces to naval officer John Fisher in the early 1900s. And it became something close to doctrine inside the British royal family through the 20th century, particularly associated with how the institution handled scandal, tabloid pressure, and public scrutiny. The logic behind it isn't arrogance, it's containment. A formal complaint acknowledges that an attack landed hard enough to require a response. It grants the attacker's framing legitimacy just by engaging with it. A formal explanation does something similar. It treats the accusation as serious enough to merit a defense, which retroactively makes the original accusation look more credible than it may have deserved. Institutions and individuals who master this discipline understand a counterintuitive truth: that responding to noise is often what turns noise into a story. Silence, held consistently, frequently makes controversies die of starvation rather than combat. Compare that to what happens when a public figure responds to every allegation, every rumor, every unflattering headline with an immediate, detailed statement. The pattern doesn't read as transparency. It reads as anxiety. Each statement becomes new content, extending the story's life instead of ending it. The person who explains fastest usually loses first. Not because they were guilty, because they fed the story the one thing it needed to survive. More of them. The one who says nothing and lets the record speak across months instead of the voice speaking across hours is very often the one who comes out the other side with the least damage. This is a harder discipline than it sounds, because every instinct in a threatened human being screams to correct the record immediately. The Stoic training is precisely the practice of not obeying that scream. Return to Galinsky's research for a moment, because there's a second layer to it worth sitting with. His studies found that powerful communicators don't just speak more directly, they use fewer qualifiers. Less "I think," less "sort of," less, if that makes sense, less trailing off into justification. Powerless communicators, by contrast, overqualify almost compulsively, because on some level they're pre-negotiating for the right to have said the thing at all. Here's what makes this genuinely interesting, rather than just a communication tip. The causality runs in both directions. Feeling powerful makes you talk this way, but talking this way also makes others perceive you as powerful, independent of whether you actually hold any formal authority in the room. Perception researchers have run studies where subjects rated the same statement as more competent and more trustworthy when it was delivered without hedging, even when the underlying content was identical. Which means the habit of over-explaining isn't just a symptom of low status. It's an active manufacturer of it. Every unnecessary qualifier, every unsolicited justification, every "let me explain why I really" is training the people around you, in real time, to see you as someone whose statements need backup to be believed. Epictetus, again, more bluntly this time. If someone tells you a person has spoken badly of you, don't defend yourself against the specific charges. Simply say, "He was not aware of my other faults," or "he would not have mentioned only these." The joke does something serious underneath the humor. It refuses to enter the negotiation. It doesn't confirm, deny, or elaborate. It treats the entire premise that your worth is up for debate as beneath engagement. None of this means never speaking. A discipline taken to its extreme becomes its own trap. The man who refuses to explain anything, ever, isn't practicing Stoic restraint. He's practicing avoidance dressed up as strength, and the people closest to him usually know the difference. The Stoics were never advocates for silence as performance. Seneca corresponded constantly, argued his positions in the Senate, wrote letters that ran for pages, defending his views on ethics and politics to Lucilius. The discipline was never say nothing. It was say nothing you don't need to say to people who haven't earned it, in a state you don't control. There's a real difference between explaining yourself to a court that has actual jurisdiction over you, a partner you've wronged, a business partner with a legitimate stake in your decision, a child who needs to understand a boundary, and explaining yourself to an audience that has no standing at all, purely because their disapproval made you uncomfortable. The first is responsibility. The second is a reflex you were never taught to interrupt. The test the Stoics would apply, if you translate their framework into a modern question, is this: does this person have legitimate authority over the outcome, or do they simply have an opinion about it? Authority earns explanation. Opinion, on its own, earns nothing but your indifference. Here's the deeper cost of chronic over-explaining that almost nobody names directly. It doesn't just cost you leverage with other people. It costs you your own certainty. Every time you construct a justification for a decision you already made, you are implicitly re-litigating that decision in your own mind. You're searching for reasons, which means some part of you is checking whether the reasons hold up. And that search, repeated enough times, across enough decisions, erodes the thing the Stoics actually cared about protecting, which was never your reputation. It was your inner steadiness. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations for an audience. He wrote it to himself, at night, in a tent, on campaign, because the actual battlefield was never Rome's enemies. It was the temptation to need Rome's approval. Coolidge understood this instinctively, decades before Galinsky ran a single study. 2 words, at a dinner table, to a stranger fishing for content. Not cruelty, certainty. He wasn't performing confidence for her benefit. He simply didn't have anything left to prove, because he'd already settled the matter with himself before he ever sat down at that table. That's the actual discipline underneath everything in this video. Not silence as a trick to make people respect you more. Silence as the natural output of a person who has already done the internal work, decided, weighed it, stood behind it, and now has nothing left to explain to anyone who wasn't in the room when the decision was made. The next time you feel that pull to defend, to clarify, to make sure they understand, pause before the first word leaves your mouth. Ask what Epictetus would ask. Is this mine to control, or theirs to decide regardless of what I say? Most of the time, the answer ends the conversation before it starts. He who explains himself has already lost. He who doesn't need to was never really at risk of losing at all.